Well, welcome once again to Global Sociology Live. We're moving towards the end of the semester, and we're in the second part of this course, in which we are talking about counter movements to the expansion of capital and also the role of certain states in the world. So last week we had Peter Evans with us, and he gave us an overview of the counter movement, and so he prefigured Eddie Webster, who is with us today from Johannesburg, South Africa, where it is about 9:15 in the evening. Eddie Webster is a sociologist in South Africa. Indeed, Eddie Webster is probably the most famous sociologist in South Africa. He is synonymous with the idea of industrial sociology, or more broadly, sociology of work. Now, you may think that's a minor part of sociology, but actually in South Africa, it has been traditionally a very central part of sociology, mainly because the anti-apartheid struggles with which sociologists had a lot to do, the anti-apartheid struggles were struggles that did revolve largely, to a large extent, around the labor movement. And Eddie Webster has been very much involved in that movement, beginning actually in the famous 1973 Durban strikes. He set up, when he came to Johannesburg and to University of Witwatersrand, he set up what is now known as SWAP, a globally known institute for the study of the labor movement. And he's been closely identified with the very innovative public sociology practices that this organization, this institute now developed. Basically, they were studies, research studies that were undertaken in close collaboration with the labor movement and the anti-apartheid struggle. At the same time as he was very much engaged with the labor movement, doing research for the labor movement, organizing courses for the labor movement, he also developed new perspectives on the sociology of work. He began to develop ideas of social movement unionism, something that sort of eventually, a decade or two later, arrived on the shores of the United States, but he had it all thought out beforehand. And he wrote a book called Cast in the Racial Mold, which was about the history of de-skilling in the Metalworkers Union and the role that race played in that de-skilling process. Anyway, come the end of apartheid in 1993, he was head of the SWAP still and teaching in the University of Witwatersrand, but a whole new vision and vista posed a whole set of new challenges for what sociology would be. The African National Congress perhaps thought that sociologists would now have to sort of retire and go back into the teaching and just stick in with teaching, and they should sort of resist engaging in politics. But that was not the attitude of many of the sociologists. And Eddie Webster and his colleagues began thinking about how to reconceptualize work in the light of the new economic strategies of the post-apartheid state, namely strategies that invoked, as we now know, increasing emphasis on market forces. And this, of course, did lead to the demobilization of parts of the labor movement, challenges for the labor movement, increased insecurity. And so he began with his colleagues to think about a broader vision for South African sociology. And together with Andries Bezuidenhout and Rob Lambert in Australia, they wrote this book that we were reading on Monday called Grounding Globalization, which is an attempt to think about work with an international or global perspective. It was no longer sufficient, they argued, and swappers argued, to think about things on a purely national terrain. And so that's the book that we discussed on Monday, and it's a book essentially that argues that insecuritization of work affects workers all over the world, and the question is, under what conditions can one actually possibly build some sort of global, international, better say, transnational set of alliances in the labor movement? What would that mean in this world today? So it's particularly appropriate that we have him here speaking from South Africa on the issue of counter movement. So, welcome, Eddie Webster.
Good evening. The English historian E.H. Carr was said to have remarked that what you see depends on which side of the mountain you stand. I stand on the southern tip of Africa in Johannesburg, the city of gold. Johannesburg was built in the first phase of globalization, if you like, the first great transformation in the late 19th century. In this brief lecture, I will do three things. Firstly, provide the social context for an understanding of global labour from a southern perspective. Then discuss my own work on the impact of global restructuring on workers, and then suggest a different way of understanding how a global counter-movement could be built in the South. Let me begin with the context. The idea of worker solidarity, or the idea that the strong should help the weak, goes back to the beginnings of industrial capitalism. It's captured in Karl Marx's well-known slogan, "Workers of the world, unite." In South Africa, this call for worker unity took a peculiar form when, in the general strike of 1922, white workers mobilized around the slogan, "Workers of the world unite for a white South Africa." Those early revolutionary socialists who brought the idea of labor internationalism from Europe failed to persuade their fellow white workers, if you like, the colonizers or the settlers, that their destiny lay with the black workers, the colonized, the indigenous population. The white workers defended their position on the grounds that they were being undercut by cheaper black labor. This segmentation of the working class remains the central challenge in building worker solidarity. There is no homogeneous proletarian condition. Here or anywhere else in the world, just as in the late 19th century, and in many parts of the world today, a bad job is better than no job at all. But, and this is the story that needs to be told, black workers in South Africa were, over time, to win their right to organize and join a trade union. Their struggle to win recognition for their unions was long and painful in the face of intransigent employers and a hostile and brutal apartheid state. An important factor in their victory was international solidarity. The campaign to boycott South Africa and impose financial sanctions was crucial in persuading the apartheid government to negotiate with the African National Congress under the leadership of Nelson Mandela. The solidarity shown, for example, by dock workers in San Francisco when they refused to unload South African ships is one amongst many examples of international solidarity. The victory of the African National Congress in 1994 was a precarious victory, as it was won in a world where power had decisively shifted to global capital. South Africa was experiencing a double transition. On the one hand, it was a transition to democracy, where a militant labor movement had won significant rights. On the other hand, it had entered the global economy where international competition was forcing employers to cut costs and produce at the China price. Let me turn to the impact of global restructuring. For labour, the process of global restructuring that began with the winning of democracy reconfigured the labour market, creating an increasingly insecure workforce. This is what we examine in our book, Grounding Globalization, Labour in the Age of Insecurity. And we took the production of white goods, fridges, washing machines, micro-ovens, as a lens to show how international competition is creating greater insecurity amongst workers in the 3 factories, in the 3 towns, in the 3 countries we studied. In Electrolux, Australia, we found resignation in the face of downsizing and the threat of relocation, but cushioned by the welfare state. In South Korea, workers in LG, life is good, responded to competition by working harder. In South Africa, workers retreated in the face of casualization of work into the household in order to engage in various survival-type strategies in what we call the informal economy. We framed the study in terms of Karl Polanyi's notion of the double movement, suggesting that this period of neoliberal globalization could best be described as the second great transformation. We did find modest experiments and initiatives to protect society against the unregulated market, but in general, their responses to global restructuring were localized. The only attempt to challenge global restructuring was an initiative of the workers in Electrolux Orange, Australia. It's a town outside Sydney. An attempt to globalize their struggle. Through the internet, they were able to establish contact with Electrolux workers in Greenville, a country town in Michigan, USA, and the home of Electrolux in Sweden. But this attempt at building worker-to-worker solidarity in production failed. The leadership of the Swedish Union was too close to management not to see the advantage to the company of relocating to China. But successful failures can provide the basis for the next step, the struggle. We remember the Montgomery bus boycott, but as Eldon Morris has shown, it was preceded by several other unsuccessful and little remembered bus boycotts. What are the implications for transnational solidarity? I want to suggest to you that in thinking about transnational solidarity, we can distinguish between 3 different types of solidarity. The first type I will call the humanitarian approach. These are acts of solidarity in defense of victims of human rights abuses, maybe victims of racism, of child labor, or workers struggling for a voice and recognition. These acts of solidarity are driven largely by moral concern, but they can be relatively powerful, as the successful anti-apartheid movement has shown. This form of solidarity can take the form of a consumer boycott or campaigns, such as the campaign against Rio Tinto over basic worker rights. These campaigns are relatively easy to organize and inexpensive in the age of the internet. The second type of transnational solidarity I would call the production approach. Here, acts of solidarity are between workers on a factory-to-factory basis. These acts are the most difficult to organize, as we see from the Australian case. The internationalization of production has created a competitive logic between countries. If workers in General Motors go on strike, other car producers will sell better. But in spite of these obstacles, there is a growing coordination of transnational solidarity in production. Volkswagen workers gather worldwide every year to coordinate their demands across Volkswagen factories from Germany, Brazil, India, and South Africa. Seafarers are the first sector to engage in global collective bargaining. Inspectors from the International Transport Workers Federation carry out inspections on vessels when they dock in port. In this way, they are able, for the first time in history, to agree on a global minimum wage in a sector and enforce it among seafarers across the world. These new forms of transnational organization challenge the conventional national-based forms of unionism that prevailed in the last century. According to an older model of international solidarity, such links tended to be channeled through specialized international departments and more likely to take place between the leaders of trade union federations. Instant and direct communication through email and Skype has changed all this. These new forms of transnational action and communication are decentralized and are as likely to be bottom-up as top-down. There is, however, a third type of solidarity, and I will call this the regulatory approach. So I'm suggesting a humanitarian, a production-based, and a regulatory approach. This approach does not try to bring workers together in production. It tries rather to build a common body of soft law, of global rights and global standards. The aim is to regulate the market rather than to replace the market. To make the market, as Peter Evans said last Wednesday, the servant of society rather than its master. One innovative idea that is being implemented in the global south is the idea of a global social floor, spelled F-L-O-O-R, not F-L-A-W. A basic social floor, a right to a pension, a right to access to health care, a child grant, and a basic minimum income, whether through a job guarantee or a direct cash grant. These are the innovations in social policy in countries such as Brazil, India, and South Africa. These new policies are the embryo of a counter-movement. But it is a counter-movement from above. The state is intervening in India through the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act to provide each rural household with a guaranteed 100 days work a year. And they've created 52 million jobs in this way. It gives a household the right to work, provided they have a job card. Some may dismiss this as mere reformism and a strategy of cooptation, but this misses the point. These could be the first steps in a staircase of a steadily expanding system of social protection. The point is that globalization is not only a constraint, it's also an opportunity for organization across borders. Globalization has accelerated the flow of a rights-based discourse. This is leading to movements from below, as we have seen in recent months in North Africa. However, the most innovative organizations that have emerged are transnational networks, such as StreetNet International, StreetNet International, based in Durban, South Africa, brings street vendors together internationally to put pressure on local municipalities to recognize their right to trade in public spaces. The choice is not between going global or remaining local, but rather navigating between the local and the global. This combination of the local and the global has led to the emergence of what Sidney Tarrow calls rooted cosmopolitans. By linking production globally through global value chains, companies have become vulnerable to new sources of power. A delay in the delivery of an engine part made in Korea to an assembly line in Australia can force employers in both Australia and Korea to the bargaining table. This is not all that different from the challenge that Henry Ford faced in Detroit in the 1930s. New sources and forms of power have emerged in the age of globalization. If it is premature to call these forms of action counter-hegemonic globalization, they have nevertheless shaken up our research agenda and challenged us to rethink the relation between global capital and the international financial institutions on one hand, and the global labor and social movements on the other. This emerging research agenda will require a multi-level analysis if it is to continue to contribute to the construction of a global counter-movement. Thank you.
That was terrific, Eddie. Thank you very, very much. And so now we open the floor for questions. So who would like to begin? There's always this pause just at the beginning. Okay, the long pause. Okay, Eddie, let me ask. Nobody wants to? Yeah, Aaron? Okay.
So in chapter 1, you give us the promise of explicating the relationship between the market and the household through what you call the crisis of reproduction. But the chapters that we read, chapter 1 and chapter 9 and pages 152 to 156, didn't really testify to a sort of gender analysis in relationship to the counter movement. So I was wondering if you could first speak to that. And then secondly, Chandra Mohanty has proffered that the devastations of neoliberalism disproportionately affect women of color from the global south. So I was wondering also if you see, sort of outside of your own empirical analysis here, if you see any possibilities for a kind of global counter-movement issuing from sort of women of color from this global south.
Okay. Right. I think the innovation in the book is that we don't only focus on what is happening in the workplace, but also try to understand how the insecurity is impacting on the lives of the households from which those workers come. And what emerges in the chapters on the individual sites that we looked at, which is Ezekani in South Africa, Changwon in Korea, and Orange in Australia, is that the households come under enormous strain, and that stress, we argue, is a gendered one. And it's a gendered one in the sense that it's, and the South African case is clearest in the book, where when there's a shortage of income in the house, conflicts emerge between men and women on how to spend that money. And but it's not only a gendered conflict, it's also an age conflict, because the older women tend to carry the burden of the household care, work, and food, and so on. So while we don't explicitly focus on the gendered nature of work, because on balance, the workers in these sites are men rather than women. On the question of colour and gender, I think you need to look maybe at other sectors of the economy to capture the significance of black women in the economy. And the example I gave in my lecture was StreetNet International. Now, Street International is, in a way, the outcome of the global restructuring, because it's people who've been pushed out of the labour market, lost formal jobs, and are trying to find a living, eco-living out in the streets, selling things, fruit, vegetables, and so on. And they are overwhelmingly women and black women. And what I was drawing your attention to is that an interesting and somewhat neglected example of transnational organizing and solidarity is actually the beginnings of these black women across the globe organizing together around their interests, to struggle for public space, to struggle for some kind of protection on the streets. Okay.
Very good.
Thank you.
Okay, Peel.
Hi, thank you very much for your interesting presentation. I would like to ask a question which is related to, like, you can say, the fundamental analysis of value production. First, I think you have some good suggestions. We have only read, like, not that much of your book, so I don't know if you cover it, but I think you have some interesting suggestion in terms of, like, for the unions and the cooperation with the community, and the idea about seeing work in combination with the whole life and taking away the line of productive and reproductive work. But as far as I see, work has been like transformed all over the globe, and social production and the cooperation in production and immaterial and like making immaterial products has become much more important, and that is like over the whole globe. And furthermore, there is also like a lot of the production of wealth today which is happening outside the traditional labor market. Like unpaid labor is also producing value, like women's unpaid labor in the house, or you could say traditional knowledge about the nature in communities. So I think that this like general transformation of production also need like new forms of organization and a broader focus on like what is work and what is actually creating value. So why don't you, in your analysis, like take the full step you could see, and not only instead of only talking about labor organizations and community organizations working together, instead talk about, okay, could we actually make an organization or organize around social production as such, which means that you have to break down the traditional boundaries between labor, unpaid labor, and paid labor, because I think in this way you could recognize what is actually producing value.
Good.
Now, I think, Peel, you've made raised an excellent question, and my current research, I've been looking at self-employed women in India, and they have, and it's quite a remarkable story. They organized themselves into the largest union in India, over 1 million members, and these are women who work either on the streets or at home making goods, and they had a major struggle to get recognition of them as workers, because the mainstream union said, you're not workers because you don't have an employer. And they said, no, we are workers because we're actually producing goods and services. And they are exchanged in the marketplace, and we can come together collectively, and we can organize ourselves like any other trade union, and they do, and they set up cooperatives, but they mobilize not against an employer, so it's not, if you like, union against anyone so much as union to empower the women. And they do that by strengthening, if they are producing a product, then they come together to get a better price in the market collectively. So they use the notion of collective solidarity to promote, even though they're not conventional workers. And I also think that you've raised a very interesting point, that part of global restructuring is the increase in homework. And you find increasingly that people women are working from home, and they're demanding the right to be recognized as a work site like any other site where you have certain rights and a right to certain organizations. So I think that maybe, Peel, it's a search agenda for you to move outside the conventional labor process and the factories that I've been looking at, and to identify those kinds of homework and see what kind of dynamics are taking place there and what potential is for organizing them.
Very good. Okay, Catherine.
Hi. I was just going to say, it seems like a lot of the critiques that you make of Polanyi, while they're really interesting, they, along with a lot of the conclusions you come to by the end of at least the sections that we read, don't necessarily match up very well with the evidence that I saw that you guys had actually collected empirically. And I was wondering what was particularly striking, there was a section that we read that was called Spaces of Hope, I believe, and it just didn't seem terribly hopeful. A lot of the places where you were looking, I believe it was in Orange, Australia, where the company that they're trying to organize against ends up just sort of moving out of every place where labor's actually organizing. And so I was wondering if you could possibly explain to me exactly where you see the hope for true international organization of labor, because I just felt like the examples that we were exposed to at least didn't really support that.
Yeah. Well, Catherine, you're the third person who said they haven't read all the chapters, and my wife tells me it's the kind of book that once you put it down, you can't pick it up again. So,
But that's the best joke of the series, Eddie.
What's that?
That's the best joke of the series.
Oh, good. Okay. Look, I think that in some ways, I tried to meet the point in my lecture, but I don't want to back off that argument. I think that in general, what we argue, and it's quite clear if you read the book through, that the way that workers respond to global restructuring is in a very local way. We talk about it as adaptation rather than challenge. And that's basically what I was outlining in my lecture. In Australia, in general, there is an accommodation. They can rely on the welfare state. In Korea, there's a strong competitive, working harder to try and make competitive. And in South Africa, there's a kind of retreat into this informal market. So we didn't find much evidence of a counter movement in those factories. And we make that very clear, with the one exception, which is the Australian case of trying to link up globally. And I think that's why, and it's drawing on the idea of a possibility, of a potential. That's why it's called Spaces spaces of hope. But the central point I'm really wanting to make, and I made it in my lecture, I think the most difficult transnationalism is factory to factory. That's the most difficult one, and I think that what I was suggesting in my lecture is that if you want to look for transnational solidarity, you're going to find examples, and we don't find many examples in our book. But there are examples of, as I mentioned, Volkswagen workers coming together and so on. You're more likely to find successful action that tries to bring not workers together in factories or in production, but workers together around establishing certain basic standards, that a basic agreement that there's no child labour, that workers have a right to organise, or what I call a social floor, a basic set of income security and so on. These are, to me, much more feasible goals. And it's actually, in some ways, more consistent with Polanyi's argument, because for Polanyi, it's the market that commoditizes, and you must regulate the market in order to protect society. It's Karl Marx who talks about bringing workers together in production. And it's a much tougher challenge. So, yes, Catherine, yes. There's very little hope from that case study. But and I think it's why I'm thinking, and why I suggest in my lecture different ways in which you can think about transnational solidarity other than factory to factory.
Eddie, I got a question. Can you hear
Yes,
me? Yeah. I mean, it was Peter Evans last week. He said that the problem with Polanyi was that he only had a national perspective. He didn't have a global one. He didn't understand the importance of a global counter-movement. You seem to be saying in your third approach, the regulatory approach, that actually the national level is a very crucial one. And perhaps there's a necessary foundation for any global project. And many of the, like these rights of workers or the basic income, these strategies, as you were suggesting, are at a national level. I mean, are you saying that the national level is the place to begin?
Well, I'm trying to, I don't want to fall into a false binary argument, Michael.
Oh, you don't.
I'm choosing between it's either the local or the global. I think I want to resist that and suggest it's really hard to maneuver between those. But I also don't want to move away from the argument that it's necessary to think in a more global way, but in the age of globalization, because I think it is a new phase in history. But there's no question about it that, I mean, the central tension in all the debates, going back to Lenin, right through to the present, is the tension between the national and the international. And quite early on in the whole debate about internationalism, the national organizing strategy becomes dominant, and unions and countries focus around national interests. So yes, obviously, that is the central. I think that is the central. That still is the central unit, and I think the kind of cosmopolitanism that some of the writers are expressing in this debate most probably downplays the significance of the national. But I mean, the way we've organised that book is around the national. It's 3 different countries. So yes, it's an obvious point. It's 3 different countries, and I think that remains the central locus of power.
Okay, very good. I'm glad you said that. Yes, who would like to go next? Kevin, do you want to say?
In your book, you talk about the potential for information technology to be used in a globalizing labor movement. But information technologies are highly privatized, and there's a tendency for there to be collusion between information technology companies and autocratic states. I think of China, the complicity between China and Google, for an example. In lieu of that, where do you see, like, how do you resolve this tension? Like, how can this problem, where do you see it, any, like, you know, what do you see of this problem?
Well, I think you've raised quite a fundamental problem for looking at it from a southern perspective. Because what people talk about as the digital divide is quite fundamental and possibly even widening. And to have a successful IT system, you need a sound, solid foundations in electricity, and countries in this region are very fragile. So it's an important difference between the past and the present, in that you can communicate instantly and directly, and you can bypass bureaucratic structures in a way that was not possible in the old internationalism. And increasingly, if you look at the union movement, you'll see that increasingly using various open source technology, and it's becoming popular, but it tends to be still within the more advanced economies, and in that sense, it's a crucial innovation, opening up opportunities, but it's not something that is decisive in the new internationalism. I would see it as facilitating communication. And I'm not only thinking about email, I'm thinking of satellite television as this to me is very powerful. You can actually capture an image of a protest in Cairo while it's happening. I mean, that may not seem significant to you from your generation, but it's a dramatic change in the way in which we are able to convey images, and the way in which it's possible to move images across, and in some ways spread. And television, I mean, it's interesting that television is something, even in shanty, poor communities, you'll find a television set. In fact, one of my interviews, one of the workers said, he much prefers having a television set than a fridge, because there's always something in the television set.
Yeah. Okay, very good.
Thank you.
Who else? Who hasn't asked the question yet? Some of you had a China question. Didn't somebody have a China question? What are you going to do with China?
Well, I think that I think that that's the future of labour will depend on the outcome of workers' actions in China, and I would argue, along with India, that there is a counter movement from above in some ways happening in China. I'm being hesitant about this. But I think that the changes in labour law and contract have opened up, and you have begun to see the spaces for some kind of independent union organisation. And these, using a Polanyian counter-movement from above. I think they open up spaces, and we're beginning to see that. And generally, I would go along with what Beverly Silver argues in her Forces of Labour. Where capital goes, labour follows. And I think that it's a question of an open situation where I think that possibilities for organisation, and if they do emerge, are going to profoundly change the nature of labour, because the dilemma that we face in a country like ours, in South Africa, is that the price of goods is not set because of the open market. So you're competing against the China price, and employers are arguing here that we can't pay those wages because you can't compete because there's an open market, and therefore we've got to relocate to a low-wage area. So they move out of South Africa into our neighbouring areas where are low-wage areas, and this way it's having a direct impact on it. So my argument about regulation, I would be not. I don't think that's tilting against windmills or something completely unthinkable. I think it's possible to begin to see some kind of global standards of regulation work, which include China.
Very good. Okay, Lally.
Yes. Dr. Webster, I actually wanted to ask you a question about the role of labor within this framework of double movement that you adopt. So, Polanyi's notion of the double movement in that the kind of unfettered market economy is going to have impacts upon all of society or many groups of society. And so as a result, counter movements will emerge from very kind of broad basis in society. And last week when Peter Evans was here with us, he very much emphasized that his vision of what he calls a counter hegemonic globalization, or that kind of Polanyian counter movement, would necessitate really bringing together various different groups with different objectives and different goals, and as he called it, braiding them together into a kind of movement of movements. And you very much emphasize one of your critiques of Polanyi is that he doesn't adequately account for the role of labor within a counter movement. So one question I have for you is, insofar as you adopt this kind of Polanyian idea of a counter movement, what do you see as being the role of labor? Does labor have some kind of central or privileged position within a counter movement? Is it just one of many other movements among movements? And in your work, you do attempt to discuss the ways that labor organizes with other community groups, but how central do you see labor as being, and what's its role within this larger counter movement?
Right. Okay. What? It's Layla, isn't it?
Lally.
Ali, okay. I think that what we have to problematize is what we mean by labor. There is an assumption, maybe it's implicit, that labor refers to organized full-time wage earning. And I think that notion of labor is inappropriate in the age of globalization. Because what restructuring has done has eroded the core labor and created an increasingly precarious or precariate informal sector, casual work, and the self-employed that I mentioned. And they are not the traditional constituency of trade unions as we understand them. So you have to think, and this would be my central point here, would be that we have to reinvent the labour movement as a social movement that includes all working people, and that would be including those who work from home. The question that Peter asked earlier It would mean those who work on the street. It would mean those who work in cyberspace, those who work in call centers. It means it means that our notion of solidarity, if you like, mutuality, has to be enhanced by diversity and recognize the diversity of the workforce. And the question earlier on about color, about gender, maybe sexuality, other features that if we're going to build a labor movement, it would have to be open and see diversity. I'm getting an echo.
Yeah, you're disappearing on us, but now you're back again.
What I'm suggesting here is quite a fundamental argument for me, and that is that we have to recognize solidarity, the diversity, as enhancing solidarity, not as something, as I argued at the beginning of my lecture, where it was workers of the world unite for a white South Africa. That kind of exclusivity of the labor movement is inappropriate in the age of globalization. So my answer would be that a reinvented labor movement that draws together traditional wage work in coalition, in alliance with the precariat, the casual and the informal, that links the workplace with the community, with the household, would be a different kind of labor movement, and I would see it as playing a central role along with NGOs, those social movements that mobilize against the commoditization of nature, the environmental movements, and other kinds of social movements. Polanyi doesn't identify the social forces that shape the counter movement. I mean, he mentions in passing trade unions, other associations that I would see a multi-natured alliance of different groups privileging labour, and I don't think that's inappropriate language. It's inappropriate language.
It is or it isn't.
I think that we have to see things in a form of a coalition of forces. But I'm also, I think, wanting, and I think Polanyi's idea also ultimately involves the state as a key actor, because a regulatory framework comes through that. So it involves relationships, developing different kinds of relationships with the local state, maybe in particular, as a key actor in building a counter movement that regulates the market.
Very good. Who would? Yeah, last question, I think. Well.
Hello, thank you so much for your lecture. It was really, really interesting. And I would like to ask you something related to your statement in the book, at least the part we've read. And you were saying that in the case of new labor internationalism, the major obstacle is the North-South divide. But at least in the parts that we've read, you're not presenting your view on how that obstacle could be overcome and what should we do in order to do it, and also how class differences are incorporated in that North-South divide and what do they mean.
Answer that in 5 minutes.
That's a tough one. Look, I think that I go along with the argument that that's a fundamental fault line. And I started off my lecture arguing that there's no homogeneous proletarian condition. And I was thinking very much of the North-South divide when I made that statement. I made the statement in the context of the gap between white workers and black workers in South Africa, because that in a way captures that North-South divide in one country. So I think it is a fault line, but one could argue, and I think that would be the way in which I would try to deal with that difficult question, and that is that what globalization has done has begun to for the first time in history, to create a genuinely global labor market. With the collapse of communism, the opening up of the markets of China, of India, of the ex-Soviet world, you brought into the labor market, you've doubled the size of the labor market over the last 20 years, but you brought workers in, unprotected workers at lower wages, creating that competition, that competitive logic that I was talking about. And there is a general and growing recognition that if workers in the developed world are going to maintain some level of decent work, they're going to have to try to find ways of connecting with workers across the globe.
I'm sorry, my kind of main question is, if the starting points are so different, if the social gap is so pronounced and so big, how can they even relate to those people? How can a worker in Germany relate to a worker in Korea? How can they find a common ground to stand on? For me, it's very hard to see a possibility of creating this, you stated in the case of regulatory approach, this common body of global rights and standards, when they can easily be respected, for example, in Germany, but not as easily in the third world, for example, countries.
Well, look, there was a debate, and it was put forward quite strongly to tie trade to what was called a social clause. In other words, trade between nations would be linked to respecting certain level of standards. It wasn't possible to get agreement around it, and the ILO, which is the central organization for labor rights globally, International Labour Organization in Geneva, doesn't have the kind of sanctions over countries that you have in the WTO, for example. So that particular idea collapsed. But what we've seen emerging is quite a strong drive to find consensus around certain minimal standards, like child labor. And there's no question that in the case of India, the demand that came across from countries like Germany in particular, but in Europe and North America, for the outlawing of child labor, say in the manufacture of carpets and rugs. It led to a public debate in India and eventually a significant reduction of the production of carpets, the use of child labor.
Mm-hmm. But if we're adopting that kind of approach, so adopting that kind of body of minimal rights, aren't we then trying to establish this new labor internationalism mostly in South, because in North those kind of minimal rights already exist, so it's targeted only to South actually then?
No, you're quite wrong there, because I think the problem is that unless workers in the North can find a way of building those linkages, their jobs are at stake. I don't know if you recall, I mean, I'm not sure whether you read the book with the same Talmudic devotion as others have, but in the opening lines of the first chapter, there's an anecdote by Thomas Friedman where he says, you know, when I was growing up as a child, my parents said to me, Tom, eat your vegetables because the people in India and China are starving. You know the story. And then he says, I tell my daughters today, do your homework, otherwise you're going to lose your jobs to the workers in India and China. I mean, I think it's easier if you take a public good like the environment and nature to see how people can mobilize together. But I think increasingly there is an acceptance, and this would be my main argument here, that there's an acceptance, like there was around slavery in the 19th century. There is a growing acceptance, I would argue, of certain norms and standards in the workplace, and that those norms and standards I think will increasingly become the base on which we will be conducting relations between countries and relations in trade. It's in that sense, it's the idea of some kind of common set of standards. If I'd made this argument about slavery in the early 19th century, you would have said very skeptically, and labor's a commodity, they're always going to buy and sell it. But the world changed. And I think that those standards, there is a growing support for a set of minimal standards.
That's a fantastic way of ending this session, Eddie. And I'm glad you gave such a wonderfully nuanced understanding of the potentialities of international global cooperation amongst labor. So thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you and goodbye.